In 1992, in one of the most remote corners of the Arabian Peninsula, a team of scientists and explorers stood at the edge of a hole in the desert floor. It hadn't always been there. Centuries ago, the ground beneath their feet had simply given way, swallowing part of an ancient fortress into the earth below. They had been guided to this spot not by a map, but by a radar image taken from the space shuttle orbiting 200 miles above the planet. What they found beneath the sand would reignite a 1,400-year-old question, a question first raised not by archaeologists, but by a scripture. Somewhere in the folds of Arabia's history, a civilization vanished. A people known for towering structures, immense wealth, and an arrogance that, according to one of the world's most widely read texts, brought about their own destruction. The Qur'an calls their city Iram, Iram of the Pillars, a place, it says, the like of which was never created in the land. For centuries, historians treated the story as legend. Then, satellites, radar, and a team of archaeologists began digging in the empty quarter, the largest sand desert on Earth, and something changed. This is the story of that search, not a search for buried treasure, but for the line between memory and myth, between scripture and soil. It is a story about a text that describes a lost city in vivid, specific detail, and about what modern science has and has not been able to confirm. By the end of this investigation, you will understand exactly what has been found, what remains uncertain, and why one of the strangest and most debated archaeological stories of the last century begins with a single Arabic phrase: Iram dat al-Imad, Iram of the Pillars. Lost cities have always captured the human imagination. Atlantis, El Dorado, Troy, each one sat for centuries on the boundary between fact and fable until, in Troy's case, a 19th century excavator with more ambition than caution decided to dig where legend pointed and found a real city underneath. Iram occupies a similar space in the history of Arabia, but with one crucial difference. It isn't only a folk legend passed down through generations of storytellers. It is described in a religious text still read, recited, and studied by more than 1 billion people today. That gives the story of Iram a different kind of weight. It isn't simply, was there a city here? It's a question that sits at the intersection of faith, history, and hard science. And that intersection is exactly where this investigation lives. For Western explorers of the 20th century, the city took on another name, born from Bedouin oral tradition: Ubar, sometimes called the Atlantis of the Sands. The British adventurer and writer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, reportedly hoped to search for it himself, describing it in his writing as a place of tribal memory, a city said to have been swallowed by the desert as punishment for its people's pride. 2 names, 2 traditions, 1 desert, and, as we'll see, a decades-long scientific effort to figure out whether they describe the same place at all. Part of what keeps this story alive, generation after generation, is that it refuses to sit still in either category we normally use to sort the past. It isn't pure mythology, the way we might treat a story about a sea monster or a vanished continent with no textual anchor at all. And it isn't settled history either, the way we'd treat the fall of Rome, backed by mountains of inscriptions, coinage, and contemporary written record. Iram sits in the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two. A place named in scripture, described with striking specificity, and yet never definitively pinned to a single set of coordinates on a modern map. That unresolved tension is precisely what has pulled explorers, historians, and now documentary audiences back to this story for the better part of a century. To understand why archaeologists were ever looking for this city in the first place, we have to start with the text that named it. The Quran mentions Iram by name once, in Surah Al-Fajr, chapter 89. The passage reads, in translation, "Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, Iram, who had lofty pillars, the likes of whom had never been created in the land?" That's the entire direct reference. 4 lines. No coordinates, no century, no ruler's name. But the Quran returns to the people connected with this city, the tribe of Ad, repeatedly, across several other chapters, and it's from these passages that a fuller picture emerges.
In Surah Al-Araf, Al-Akaf, Hud, and Ash-Shu'ara, the Quran describes Ad as a people who came after the time of Noah, who grew powerful and prosperous, and who built extensively. Do you construct on every high place a sign, amusing yourselves? One verse asks. And take for yourselves palaces and fortresses, that you might abide eternally. The tribe is described as physically formidable, given great strength, and settled in a region called Al-Akaf, literally the sand dunes or the winding sands, a term that many classical Arab geographers placed in the southern Arabian Peninsula, roughly across parts of what is today Yemen and Oman. According to the Qur'anic narrative, a prophet named Hud was sent to warn the people of Ad against their arrogance and their turn toward idolatry. They rejected him, and the text describes their destruction through a violent, howling wind, described in Surah Al-Haqqa as a furious wind that Allah imposed upon them for 7 nights and 8 days in succession, leaving the people lying fallen as if they were hollow trunks of palm trees. That's the account as it stands in Scripture. A proud, powerful civilization, known for monumental construction, warned and destroyed. No exact location, no excavation instructions, just a story, repeated with variations across several chapters, that generations of Islamic scholars, and later Western researchers, would try to place on an actual map. Before we can talk about a lost city, we need to talk about the people the Quran says built it. Because in Islamic tradition, Ad isn't treated as a myth in the way Atlantis is treated in Western literature. Classical Muslim historians, including the 9th and 10th century scholar al-Tabari, wrote about Ad as a real, historical Arabian tribe, situated within a broader chronology of pre-Islamic Arabian peoples that also included the Thamud, whose rock-cut dwellings at Madain Saleh in modern Saudi Arabia have actually been excavated and studied extensively by archaeologists. That distinction matters. The people of Thamud, also mentioned in the Quran, correspond to a documented civilization, often identified with the Nabateans' predecessors or neighbors, whose carved tombs still stand today and are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Their existence isn't in question. What remains far murkier is Ad, and by extension, Iram. Pre-Islamic Arabian oral history, and later Islamic-era historical writing, placed Ad somewhere in the deep past, before written records as we understand them existed in that specific region. Some classical accounts associate them loosely with the frankincense trade routes of southern Arabia. Others tie them to older Semitic tribal genealogies stretching back toward the biblical figure of Shem. What's consistent across nearly all of these traditions is the geography. South Arabia, near the sands, associated with wealth and long-distance trade. This is where the story starts to intersect with something archaeologists can actually study. Because southern Arabia, especially the region historians call Dhofar, spanning parts of modern Oman and Yemen, was home to one of the ancient world's most lucrative industries, the frankincense trade. To understand why this region produced legends of lost cities buried in sand, you need to understand what the region actually was 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Frankincense, the aromatic resin harvested from boswellia trees native to Dhofar, was, in the ancient world, worth a fortune. It was burned in temples from Jerusalem to Rome, used in religious rituals across multiple civilizations, and it could only be grown in a narrow strip of land along the southern Arabian coast and the Horn of Africa. That scarcity created immense wealth for whoever controlled the trade routes carrying it north, across the desert, toward Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Those routes crossed the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest contiguous sand desert on Earth, covering roughly 250,000 square miles across parts of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, and the UAE. It is one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Shifting dunes that can reach several hundred feet high, summer temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and almost no permanent water. For caravans to survive that crossing, they needed fixed points, wells, oases, and fortified way stations where they could resupply. Historians and archaeologists agree that a network of such trading posts almost certainly existed along the frankincense routes in antiquity. The question that drove decades of expeditions wasn't whether wealthy trading settlements existed in this region. It was whether one specific settlement, the one remembered in both Qur'anic scripture and Bedouin oral tradition as a city of towering pillars, could actually be located and identified.
The Quran isn't the only ancient text that hints at a lost civilization in this part of Arabia. Long before satellite archaeology entered the picture, medieval Arab geographers were already writing about a legendary city buried by sand. The 10th century Yemeni historian and geographer al-Hamdani wrote extensively about the tribes and geography of southern Arabia, including traditions tied to Ad. The 13th century geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi, in his monumental geographical dictionary, recorded local traditions about a city called Ubar, describing it as a place associated with wealth and eventual ruin. Bedouin oral tradition in the region carried its own version of the story for centuries, independent of written scholarship. Tales of a city that had once stood somewhere along the old incense roads before vanishing beneath the dunes. The 1001 Nights, the famous collection of Middle Eastern folk tales compiled over centuries, includes references to Iram of the Pillars as well, blending it into its own layer of legend. By the 20th century, this combination of scripture, geography, and oral tradition had produced enough intrigue that Western explorers began actively searching for the city. British explorer Bertram Thomas, the first Westerner known to have crossed the empty quarter, wrote in the 1930s about hearing local Bedouin describe a lost city called Ubar, buried somewhere beneath the sands he was crossing. T.E. Lawrence is often cited as having taken an interest in the legend as well, describing it in correspondence as a place worth searching for, though he never mounted an expedition himself. None of this constituted proof, but it meant that by the time modern technology entered the picture, there was already a substantial, centuries-deep body of tradition pointing toward the same rough region and the same rough story. The breakthrough, or at least what many involved believed was a breakthrough, didn't come from a shovel. It came from space. In the late 1980s, an American documentary filmmaker and writer named Nicholas Clapp became fascinated by the Ubar legend after reading Bertram Thomas's decades-old account. Clapp began researching the story in earnest and eventually connected with a small, unusual team: British explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes, Los Angeles attorney and amateur archaeologist George Hedges, and, critically, access to satellite imaging technology developed by NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In 1992, the Space Shuttle Endeavour carried an imaging radar system called SIRC into orbit. This system was capable of detecting subtle variations in ground texture invisible to the naked eye and even to conventional cameras, including faint traces of ancient, long-abandoned caravan tracks compacted into the desert floor over centuries of repeated use. Combined with earlier Landsat satellite data, CLAP's team was able to trace these faint trackways as they converged, funnel-like, toward a single point in the Dhofar region of Oman, near a place called Shisra. That convergence was the clue that mattered. If ancient caravan routes across an enormous, largely trackless desert were all bending toward the same spot, something at that spot had once been important enough to draw traffic from every direction. The team, working with the government of Oman, secured permission to excavate. What they found at Shisra, beginning in 1992, was a real archaeological site, and it was significant. Excavations, led in coordination with American archaeologist Juris Zarins, uncovered the remains of an octagonal fortress built with substantial defensive towers situated directly above a large natural limestone cave. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic analysis indicated that the site had been occupied across an extraordinarily long span, with evidence of activity dating back roughly to 3000 BCE and continuing intermittently through to around the medieval Islamic period, roughly the 14th or 15th century CE. Crucially, the excavation also explained the region's most striking geological feature. The fortress at Shisra had partially collapsed into the very cave system it was built above. At some point in its history, researchers believe most likely during a period of heavier rainfall that dissolved the limestone bedrock below, the ground gave way and a portion of the fortress dropped into a massive sinkhole, exactly the kind of dramatic, sudden swallowing event that oral tradition might plausibly transform across centuries of retelling into the story of a proud city struck down and buried by divine punishment.
Whoever controlled Shisr was plugged into a wide, valuable trading system. Exactly the kind of wealth the Qur'an and older Arabian traditions associate with the people of Ad. Given the site's location, its age, its trade connections, and the dramatic sinkhole collapse, CLAP's team announced their find to the world as the long-sought city of Ubar. And by extension, in popular media coverage at the time, it was frequently described as the physical location behind the Qur'anic Iram. There is real substance behind the excitement. The geographic match is compelling. Shisr sits within the broader region that classical and Quranic tradition associates with the lands of Ad, in the sands of southern Arabia. The site's age places it firmly within a plausible window for the kind of ancient, pre-Islamic Arabian civilization the Quran describes. Its role as a wealthy trade hub aligns with descriptions of Ad as a people of great means, capable of large-scale construction. And the physical evidence of a dramatic structural collapse into a sinkhole offers a strikingly literal, physical echo of a city brought low. The kind of event that could easily seed a folk memory of sudden, catastrophic ruin. Juris Zarins himself, in published statements following the excavation, described Shisr as very likely one of the key sites tied to the regional trade network that produced the Ubar legend, giving the archaeological community its first serious physical candidate for a story that had, until then, existed only in text and oral tradition. For many observers, journalists, documentary makers, and members of the public, this was enough. Headlines around the world in the early 1990s declared that the lost city of Ubar, or even, in some cases, the Atlantis of the Sands, had finally been found. But that wasn't the end of the investigation. And here, the story gets more careful and more honest. Several scholars, including some archaeologists directly involved in Arabian Peninsula research, urged caution almost immediately.
The most significant issue is one of scale and structure. The fortress at Shisr, while genuinely important, is relatively modest in size. A single fortified compound with defensive towers, not a sprawling city of the kind that later folklore and some readings of the Qur'anic description of lofty pillars might suggest. Some archaeologists have pointed out that Shisr functioned primarily as a fortified well and caravan stop, rather than as a large urban center in its own right. There is also a linguistic and interpretive debate that predates the Shisr excavation entirely, rooted in how the phrase Iram dat al-Imad should even be read. A number of classical and modern Islamic scholars have argued that Iram in the Quran may not refer to a city at all, but rather to the tribe of Ad itself, with Iram functioning as an ancestral or clan name, making Iram of the Pillars a description of a tent-dwelling people known for their tall stature or their impressive tent poles, rather than a literal reference to a walled city with architectural columns. Under this reading, the entire premise of hunting for the city of Iram as a single physical location may rest on a translation assumption rather than a textual certainty. Additionally, the name Ubar itself, the term used in the Bedouin legend that guided Clapp's expedition, does not appear anywhere in the Quran. It is a name drawn from regional oral tradition and later Arabic geographical writing, not from scripture. That means the entire chain connecting Shisr to Qur'anic Iram runs through an intermediate identification. Shisr equals Ubar, and Ubar equals Iram, rather than a direct link between the archaeological site and the Qur'anic text itself. Each link in that chain is separately debated by specialists. So where does the scholarly consensus actually stand more than 3 decades after the Shisr excavation? The honest answer is divided, but not dismissive. Archaeologists broadly agree that Shisr is a genuine, significant, and well-documented ancient site, a real fortified trading post that operated across millennia along the frankincense routes of southern Arabia, and whose partial collapse into a limestone sinkhole is a well-documented, verifiable geological event. That much is settled archaeological fact, published in peer-reviewed research and confirmed through radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic excavation.
Never have referred to a single fixed location at all, but rather to a network of trading settlements across the region, remembered collectively through generations of oral storytelling, and eventually condensed into the memory of one legendary city. A common pattern in oral traditions worldwide, where multiple real places and events blend into a single symbolic narrative over time. It's also worth noting that no inscription, artifact, or text recovered at Shisr has ever explicitly named the site as Ubar or Iram. The identification rests entirely on geographic, historical, and circumstantial reasoning. Strong reasoning, in the view of many researchers, but not the kind of direct textual confirmation that would settle the question definitively, the way, for example, an inscribed cornerstone or a contemporary written record naming the city would. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the crux of the entire debate. Archaeology, at its most rigorous, draws a firm line between a site that fits a legend geographically and historically, and a site proven to be that legend. Troy is instructive here again. Even after Heinrich Schliemann's 19th century excavations at Hisarlik uncovered a genuine Bronze Age city with layers of destruction by fire, scholars spent generations afterward debating exactly which layer, if any, corresponded to the Troy of Homer's poetry. And some of that debate continues today. Shisr occupies a similar position. It is a real, dated,
physically compelling site sitting inside the correct historical and geographic frame. Whether it is the exact place named in a text written centuries before the excavation itself is a separate, harder question. One that inscriptions, not radar images, would ultimately need to answer. Given all of that nuance, it's worth directly addressing some of the claims that circulate widely online, because several of them go well beyond what the actual evidence supports. One frequent claim is that archaeologists have definitively proven the Quran correct by finding Iram at Shisar. That overstates the case. What has been found is a real, ancient, sinkhole-collapsed trading fortress in the correct general region. A striking and meaningful discovery, but not an inscription-confirmed identification of the specific city named in Scripture. A second common claim, often repeated in the opposite direction, is that Shisar disproves the existence of Iram, or that the Ubar identification was a media-driven exaggeration with no real substance. That also overstates the case. The site is genuinely significant, genuinely ancient, and genuinely tied by geography and trade history to the broader traditions surrounding Ad and the incense roots. Dismissing it entirely ignores real, peer-reviewed archaeological work. A third misconception involves the scale of the city itself. Popular retellings sometimes describe Ubar or Iram as a vast metropolis with soaring towers, closer to a fantasy depiction than to the archaeological reality of a fortified desert way station, however important that way station may have been to regional trade. The most accurate, defensible position, the one supported by the archaeologists who actually excavated the site, sits between those extremes. A real, significant discovery, strongly suggestive of the broader historical and geographic tradition described in both the Quran and Bedouin legend, but not a conclusively proven one-to-one match with the Qur'anic city of Iram. Let's separate, plainly, what is established fact from what remains an open question. Established. The Quran describes a people called Ad, associated with a place named Iram, known for tall construction, destroyed by a violent windstorm after rejecting the Prophet Hud. Established. Classical Arab historians and geographers, independently of the Quran, recorded traditions about a lost city called Ubar in the same general region of southern Arabia. Established. An ancient fortified site at Shisar, in the Dhofar region of Oman, was discovered using satellite radar imaging in 1992, excavated by a team including archaeologist Juris Zarins, and confirmed through radiocarbon dating to have been occupied from roughly 3000 BCE through the medieval period. Established. That site partially collapsed into a limestone sinkhole and functioned as a genuine hub along the ancient frankincense trade routes, with imported pottery confirming long-distance trade connections. Unproven and actively debated among specialists, whether Shisar is the same place remembered in oral tradition as Ubar, whether Ubar and the Quranic Iram refer to the same location at all, or whether Iram refers to a tribe rather than a city, whether any single archaeological site will ever be conclusively identified as Iram, given the absence of any inscription confirming the name.
That is not a disappointing answer. It's an honest one. And honesty is precisely what separates serious historical investigation from either faith-based certainty on one side or reflexive skepticism on the other. Stepping back from the archaeological debate, it's worth asking why this story has held so much weight across 14 centuries of Islamic scholarship in the first place. Because its significance was never really about pinpointing GPS coordinates in the Rub al-Khali. The account of Ad and Iram, as it appears throughout the Quran, functions as a moral narrative as much as a historical one.
It describes a people who reached extraordinary heights of power, wealth, and architectural achievement, and who, according to the text, allowed that success to curdle into arrogance, rejecting the warning of a prophet sent specifically to correct their course. The recurring phrase across these passages isn't really about the pillars themselves. It's about what the pillars represented. Human confidence in permanence, in monuments believed capable of outlasting judgment itself. That theme repeats across the Quran's treatment of several ancient peoples, including Thamud and the people of Lot, forming a broader pattern often referred to by scholars of Islamic studies as a cycle of destroyed nations. Communities warned, communities that rejected the warning, and communities whose downfall is presented as instructive for later generations rather than as isolated historical trivia. Whether or not a single archaeological dig in Oman ever produces an inscription reading Iram, the narrative's function within the Quran has always centered on that moral architecture, not merely on the physical one. There's something fitting about the fact that this investigation doesn't end with a neat bow, with a plaque reading, "Here stood Iram." Real history rarely works that way, especially history this old, in terrain this unforgiving, built by a people who left behind wells and fortress walls rather than monumental inscriptions. What we're left with instead is a layered convergence, a scriptural account over 1,400 years old, describing a proud civilization and a place of towering pillars. A body of independent Bedouin oral tradition and medieval Arab geographical writing describing a lost city called Ubar in the same general region, and finally, a genuine archaeological site found using 20th century satellite technology, excavated with careful modern methodology, radiocarbon dated, and confirmed to have collapsed into the earth in exactly the dramatic way legend describes. None of those three threads, on its own, proves the others. But taken together, they represent one of the rare instances where scripture, oral history, and hard archaeological evidence all point independently toward the same corner of the map. That convergence is genuinely remarkable, whatever your starting beliefs. And it's exactly why serious researchers, not just documentary producers, have kept returning to this question for over 3 decades. Somewhere beneath the dunes of the empty quarter, a fortress still sits half swallowed by a collapsed limestone cave. A real place, walked by real archaeologists, its walls dated to a time before most of recorded Arabian history begins. Whether that fortress is truly the Iram described in the Quran may never be settled with absolute certainty. But the search for it has done something valuable regardless. It has taken a story once dismissed by some as pure legend and shown that its geography, its era, and even its central catastrophic event line up with real, physical evidence buried in the sand for thousands of years. That is where this investigation stands today, not at a final answer, but at an honest one. A civilization once stood somewhere in these sands, proud and powerful enough to be remembered across 14 centuries, in a scripture read by over 1 billion people, and in the oral memory of desert tribes who never read a word of it. The desert took that city. It took a very long time and a piece of space shuttle technology to even begin finding it again. If you want more evidence-based investigations into the history behind the Quran, stories built on real scholarship, not speculation, subscribe and join us for the next one.